Hello, second grade, and welcome back to our second week of history. Today we're going to be discussing America's pioneers. So let's get started. The United States was growing. More people sailed to America looking for a better life. More and more states were being added to our country. Big cities such as Boston, Philadelphia, and New York were growing bigger and bigger. Some men felt crowded and wanted to move on. They wanted to be surrounded by trees and land instead of people and buildings. They did not want to be fenced in. But where would they go? There was unsettled land in the West. Some people began to talk about moving there. Hardly anything was known about the West. There were no towns. This meant there were no doctors or stores. There were no sheriffs to uphold the law. There were many wild animals, too. It was a new frontier. The brave men and women who dared to move westward were called pioneers. A pioneer is a person who goes first and clears the way for the others who will follow. The first pioneers were men who traveled alone. Most of these pioneers walked. Some pioneers had mules to carry the few things they owned. What was a pioneer's main mission, you might ask? His gun. With this gun, he could shoot his dinner and protect himself from danger. These pioneers prepared the way for whole families to move west. Now, do you remember? So we have, we're actually going to skip these. So, let's say, a pioneer of pioneers. In 1775, the land that makes up Kentucky was bought out from the Cherokee Indians. At that time, Kentucky was a wilderness of thick woods. How could pioneer families travel through the wilderness? Some would need to pave the way. While many Americans were fighting the war for independence, Daniel Boone became one of America's first great pioneers. Led by Daniel, 30 men with axes chopped a rough path through Virginia to the mountains of Kentucky. This rough path through forests and over mountains became known as the Wilderness Road. As the years passed, thousands of pioneer families traveled west. Westward ho! Thousands of families wanted to be pioneers. They traveled across the Great Plains. Many even traveled to the other side of the Rocky Mountains. Many families decided to travel together in wagon trains. Together, they could help each other in times of trouble. A wagon master was chosen. He was a man who had made the long trip before. He knew the dangers of the trip. He knew where to hunt for food and find water along the way. It was his job to safely lead the families of the wagon train on their journey. Packing for the journey. Because there were no stores along the way, pioneers had to pack their supplies. If their food ran out, they would starve. If they did not pack warm clothes and blankets, they might become sick. Food, warm clothing, and blankets would not be forgotten. Bags of flour and cornmeal, as well as coffee and salted slabs of bacon, were loaded into the wagons. Pioneers also packed kettles and coffee pots for cooking over the fire. Pioneers packed axes and nails to build houses when their journey was over. They also took plows to break up the ground and seeds to plant in their gardens. Pioneers had to decide how many cows to take. Sometimes a cow was tied to the back of the wagon. After these things were packed, there was hardly any room left in the wagon for other things. Pioneer women had to give away most of their pretty dishes and furniture. They had to carefully pick which special things they could take with them. Often, they took their favorite books so they could teach their children to read. The men had to choose the animals to pull their wagons. Because an ox is much stronger than a horse, ox were usually chosen instead of horses. Now, do you remember? Number 1. Who were the people who dared to move to the American West? Those are the pioneers. Number 2. Who was one of America's first great pioneers? That would be Daniel Boone. How did the very first pioneers travel? They walked. Traveling west. Hello, my name is James, and this is my sister Anna. We are on our way west on the wagon train. We feel excited about this new adventure, but a little sad too. Saying goodbye to our friends was hard. Bumpity bump! The wagon rolls on, and soon we could no longer see our friends who stayed behind. We are so glad our friends Samuel and Martha are going west too. In fact, they are in the wagon right in front of us. Crickety crack! The wagon wheels roll over stones and through forests. Each day, the wagon master leads us as far as he can. On rainy days, it's hard to get very far. Our wagon wheels sink in mud easily. On those days, we have to make camp until the ground is dry. Days have passed. Day by day, we moved farther west. Day by day, the land changed. The forest was gone. Instead, there were all kinds of flowers, bushes, and trees that we had never seen before. More days have passed. At last, our wagons rolled onto the prairie, and now there were hardly any trees. All we could see was tall prairie grass waving in the breeze. Sometimes in the morning, the wagon master sends my father and other men on horseback to hunt meat. There are prairie chickens and rabbits. But what we really hope for is buffalo. A large buffalo would be plenty of fresh meat for everyone. It would taste so good after days and days of salted bacon. You should have seen Anna's eyes the first time she saw a buffalo. From nose to tail, a full-grown buffalo can be over 10 feet long. The wagon master told us that a buffalo weighs about 1,000 pounds. Buffalo have a pair of horns like cows, but their brownish hair is long and coarse or rough. Anna and Martha giggled. The buffaloes have beards. The other children laughed too. The wagon master told us that the buffalo is the largest American animal. The Indians hunt the buffalo too. They eat the meat and use the buffalo skin to make clothes and tents. Do you think we'll see an Indian? We asked. You'll probably get to see one before long, said the wagon master. The next day, as the wagon rolled on, we did see an Indian. He sat proudly on his fine horse and watched the line of wagons pass by. He seemed to get smaller and smaller as we watched him from the back of our wagon. Each day at noon, the wagons rolled to a stop. My mother and the other mothers climbed out of the wagons and began to prepare lunch. We climbed out of the wagons too. Samuel and I helped feed and water the animals. Anna and Martha stretched their legs and ran. Samuel and I ran too, after our chores were finished. How good it felt to run after sitting for 5 hours in the wagon. "You're it!" cried Samuel as we began a game of tag. But suddenly the game stopped. There were several small holes in the ground. "I wonder what lives in there," Anna asked. In another hole not far away, a small furry animal popped out to stare at us. From another hole, out came another. Samuel and I tried to catch one, but the small animals always popped back into their holes. "They are prairie dogs, children," said the wagon master as he walked by. "This is a prairie dog town." Suddenly, we saw a black shadow moving over the ground. Pop, pop, pop! Every prairie dog was disappearing into its hole. We looked up to see a hawk circling the prairie dog's town. The hawk watched the holes. "Too bad, Mr. Hawk. You'll have to find something else for your dinner," I laughed. "It's time for our dinner," shouted Samuel. Then off we ran for a dinner of leftover buffalo meat, cornbread, and molasses. As soon as everyone finished, we got back into our wagons. I wonder what else we will see today. This land is full of surprises. The wagon rolled on. Bumpity-bump, crickety-crack. Now, do you remember? Number 1. What is the type of land called that has hardly any trees and just tall grass? That would be a prairie. Number 2. Name the large animal that lived on the prairies and provided fresh meat for the pioneers. That would be buffalo. And number 3, what tiny animal lived in their own towns on the prairies? That would be prairie dogs. The pioneers had to work together and help each other. At night, the wagons formed a circle. This made a fort for protection. It also provided an area to corral the cattle. The corral would keep the cattle from wandering off or being attacked by wild animals. As the pioneers traveled westward, many of them put their trust in God for protection. Perhaps as they left the Great Plains and headed into the Rocky Mountains, they were reminded of the Lord's constant help. The Bible says, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. That is in Psalms. All right, that will be it for our history lesson. Thank you, guys.